Hello and welcome to Unity Presbyterian Church Online. This week in worship, Pastor David begins a series on the book of Philippians, which is also the book of joy. Let's listen.
Well, Sarah and I, we got to visit the site where the International Olympic Committee is held over this summer, and it was a fascinating place. The town itself is all things Olympic. In fact, as you're walking around, they have a countdown clock until the next Olympics, down to the very second. Here it is for you. So you can see when we went, there are 1,138 days left until the next Olympics. That's the time to count down for. It was all things Olympics, and they had a museum. And in the museum, they had all of these different exhibits that brought you into Olympics past and brought you into some of the most famous moments of the Olympics. For instance, here was one exhibit. It had the original gold medals from the first Olympics. I thought, oh, that is so neat to see how historic they looked. And in another exhibit, you could take a selfie with that creepy mascot from the Paris Olympics. So they had a whole bunch of stuff there, which was quite fun. But the experience, it had me reliving some of those stories, those great stories from Olympic Games past, such as, if you're watching this last Olympics, Simone Biles won 3 gold medals. And I want to show you a picture in just a second of, it was taken right after she won one of those gold medals. And I wonder, what do you notice? What do you notice in this picture? What I notice is pure joy. Pure joy. I don't know how you could look more joyful than Simone does in that moment. And what I found even more inspiring was thinking about what she had to overcome to get to that moment. Flashback to the Olympics before this last one in 2020. She was favored to win just about every gold medal in gymnastics, but then she began to experience what is known as the twisties, where you lose your spatial awareness when you are up in the air flipping. It's very dangerous for a gymnast. Simone had to withdraw from the majority of her events. She went from being an all-around favorite to not even competing. I mean, can you imagine the amount of disappointment after training year after year for that moment? Can you imagine the self-doubt that she must have felt after withdrawing from all of those games? I mean, she wasn't even sure if she was going to compete in the next Olympics when it came in 2024. But she did. She chose to push through her fear and her doubt, and that picture of joy that we saw, that was the result of her pushing through all of that. So today, we're going to talk a lot about joy because we're studying what Pastor Dana noted is the most joyful letter in the New Testament, the letter to the Philippians. Yes, over the next 4 weeks, we're going to study roughly the highlights of one chapter per week. So if you'd like, you can read along with us at home. So starting this week, you can read Philippians chapter 1, and then after next week, chapter 2, and it's only 4 chapters long. So at the end of this month, we'll have studied all of Philippians. And I know that as we read and study this letter together, we will discover ways to become more joyful in our own lives. Now, every letter has a writer and a recipient, and that includes this letter to the Philippians. So let's start with who was the recipient of this letter. Well, the recipient was the first church in Philippi, in the city of Philippi. Now, the city of Philippi was a Roman colony, although it was originally a Greek colony when it was conquered by Alexander the Great's father. His name was Philip of Macedon, and it was renamed Philippi after him. And you can see on this map where Philippi was. So on the left side, far left, you see Rome. On the far right bottom, you see Jerusalem. And then if you go right in the middle, up to the north, you see where Philippi was. And it was a medium-sized city that was surrounded by farmland, and it was where many Roman soldiers went to retire. That's where they retired. So this is who the letter is to, the very first church in that city. Who is the sender of the letter? Well, the sender of the letter is the Apostle Paul. Paul came to Philippi during one of his missionary journeys, and it was there that he said, there's no church here. There's no Christian church, so I'm going to gather a group of people. I'm going to gather a group of people. I'm going to share with them how Jesus is the Messiah. And those who respond, those who believe, we're going to start a community. And that community is going to become a church. That's exactly what he did. Now, Paul, he was not one to stay in one area for years and years and years. No, he'd stay long enough for that church to be established, to have a firm foundation. And then he'd go on to the next city, and he would do the same thing. He would gather people together and start another church. So after he has left, after he's no longer with the people of Philippi, he writes them a letter. And from this letter, you can tell he left his heart in Philippi, that he loved that early church that he helped to start. So let's study this letter together, and let's find the joy within it and within ourselves. We're going to begin in chapter 1, verse 3. Here's what Paul says. I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Okay, what do you notice from the opening lines of this letter? I notice the theme of joy. I always pray with joy. If you were to count, Paul uses the words joy and rejoicing 16 times within these 4 short chapters. Later on, he actually tells the Philippian church in chapter 4, always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. Surely you've wondered about those words before, when you've gone through something really hard, or when you've gone through a crushing disappointment, and you think, really? Really, Paul? Always be full of joy? I just went through a breakup. How can I rejoice? Or I just failed that math test. I'm not really feeling very joyful right now. Lamenting I can do, absolutely. Or complaining, I'm great at complaining. But rejoicing? Rejoicing at all times and in all circumstances? Paul, I don't think so. And yet that's exactly what Paul is asking this church to do. So how does Paul expect us, if we're applying it to ourselves, to have joy in all circumstances of life? Well, notice the location of Paul's joy. He says, always be full of joy in the Lord. That's the location, in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. You see, for Paul, joy was more than just a mood or a feeling or an emotion. Joy is the ability to see beyond one's feelings of the moment to the beauty of God in the world. Now, here's what that means. Feelings come and go. And in the moment, they're very real, aren't they, right? You're feeling that emotion, but they come and they go. Sometimes you are happy and sometimes you feel really down, and neither one of those feelings will last forever. Happiness fades, as does sadness, as does anger, right? As does grief, as does elation. So Paul encourages us to learn how to see the goodness of God no matter what you may be feeling at the moment. Yes, I may have just failed that math test, and there will be repercussions for that, right? I might have to study a little bit harder. I might have a lower grade. I might be feeling bad about myself. But even if I'm down about that, in that moment of disappointment, can I recognize the presence of God? Can I say, yes, I'm mad right now. I'm okay with that feeling, but God is still here. God is still present. God is surrounding me right now. And can that then fill me with that spark of joy? That recognition can fill us with joy in all times and all seasons of life. So what we're learning from Paul is that joy is not just an emotional reaction like most of our feelings are. Joy involves intentionally looking for the presence of God in every moment you go through. Now, how is Paul able to do this? Well, he's able to do it because of his perspective of the ways that God is at work in the world. Here's what he says in the next verse. He says, I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work in you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. Okay, so again, Paul started this church and then he left, right? And so we might be thinking that Paul is the one who began the good work. Paul started the church. He started this good work to create a community right there in Philippi. But that's not what Paul is implying here. No, Paul knows that it was God working through him that really began the good work. And if God began the good work, then you can trust that God is going to finish the job. This is true on a church level when we look at our church and the work we're involved in, or when we look at the work of this church in Philippi. It's also true on an individual level for you and for me. When you look at your life, you will no doubt see a mixture of successes and failures, accomplishments you're proud of, and episodes you'd rather forget. You're going to look at your life and you're going to see the good and the bad, right? The ups and the downs. What Paul wants us to do is recognize that God has been at work in all of it. And God is working to bring you to a place of feeling complete and feeling whole. That is God's goal for each and every one of our lives. Here's an example. I want you to imagine walking into an art studio. And in that art studio, you see just a big block of marble. And in that moment, the marble is completely unfinished. So to most of us, to the untrained eye, it just looks like ordinary, rough, and unfinished. But the sculptor looks at it, and the sculptor says, inside that, there's a masterpiece. I just need to keep chipping away until it is revealed. That's exactly how Michelangelo described creating the David. He said he could see the figure inside the stone, and his job was simply to remove the excess. In the same way, God sees who you are meant to be in Christ. From the moment you gave your life to God, God began his good work in you. And it might look messy and unfinished right now, but God never abandons his projects. God keeps shaping us and chipping away and refining us until Christ's image shines through in you. So yes, you are an unfinished product, and that's okay. I am too. But God is still working in both you and me. So God was at work in these Christians in Philippi. But a quick question, have you ever wondered where Paul was when he was writing these letters about God's work? Well, he tells us in the next verse. He said, "It is right for me to feel this way about all of you, since I have you in my heart. And whether I am in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me." Paul mentions being in chains, and he does so for a reason. When Paul wrote this letter, he was in prison in Rome. And the crime he was charged with? Simply being a Christian. Remember when Paul said to always be full of joy? Those words carry a little heavier of a weight when we recognize that he wrote them from a prison cell. Paul does not know if he's ever going to make it out of Rome, and yet he still prays with joy. What an incredible example that Paul is setting for us here. So consider the challenges that you're going through right now in your life. Where is it the most difficult to find joy in your life right now? What we need to recognize is that the events that happen to us, they matter. But what matters more is how you interpret and respond to those events. Paul trusts that God is able to use everything he goes through to somehow not just make his life okay, but to somehow share the gospel message with the world. That's what he says just a couple verses later in verse 12. He says, "I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the gospel." Now, the gospel, that's a word we use when we want to refer to the salvation that comes through Jesus Christ. And Paul believes that everything that has happened to him, the beatings, the imprisonments, the cold, lonely nights, that if he offered those things to God, that God was willing to use them to help spread the gospel message. And Paul deeply believed that God could use his present circumstances, no matter how challenging they were, to bring about this good. So to Paul, his imprisonment was not a setback. No, it actually became the tool that God used to spread the gospel. And we know that because of what he says next. Here's verse 13. He says, "For everyone here," meaning in prison, right? Everyone here in prison, including the whole palace guard, knows that I am in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here, meaning here in Rome, have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. So Paul, he's in a situation that none of us would want to find ourselves in, right? Imprisoned in Rome, and yet he believes that God is going to use his imprisonment to inspire faith in other people. And in particular, he points out two audiences. The first one, he says, that are influenced by his message is the whole palace guard. Now, these are elite Roman soldiers who reported to the emperor himself. They would have been in charge of protecting Caesar and being in charge of some of the high-profile prisoners, such as Paul. And instead of being intimidated by these guards, he viewed them as a literal captive audience. He said, okay, since I'm here, since I'm in prison, and since you have to be here keeping watch over me, I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to share with you about Jesus. I'm going to share with you about the gospel. He says the whole prison guard was influenced by these words. You see, for Paul, his prison cell became his pulpit. What must have looked like defeat to the outside world became victory through Christ, because he chose to share with those guards about the good news of Jesus. And it's not just Paul that can do this. We can do this too, where we use the hard moments of our life, we offer them to God and say, God, use these moments to somehow bring about the gospel, the news of the gospel in this world. Let me give you an example. There was a woman named Joni Tada, and when she was 17, she dove into shallow water and accidentally broke her neck, becoming a quadriplegic. And at first, she reports that she thought her life was over. It was over at that moment. Her journey of pain and disability, what she recounts though, she says it led her to asking deep questions about God that she never asked before. And here are her exact words. She says, when I snapped my neck under the weight of a dive into shallow water, permanent and total paralysis smashed me up against the study of God. And here's what she found. She found that over time, her wheelchair was not the end of her usefulness. In that moment, she thought, my life is over. But then as she gave that to God and said, God, I don't know how you can use my disability, but God, if you're willing, please use it. What she found was that became the very platform that God used to spread the gospel message, because she started sharing her testimony. She started sharing her artwork. She started sharing books, particularly to people with disabilities worldwide. And if you look her up today, now millions have heard about the gospel because of her influence. Whether it is a prison cell or a wheelchair, if you offer it to God, God is willing to use it. Now, prison guards, they were one audience that Paul influenced, but I wonder if you noticed the second one. The second one, Paul says, most of the believers in Rome. His exact words were, because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. What he's saying is that other Christians saw Paul's imprisonment, and I would think that if they saw his imprisonment, what they would feel in that moment would be fear, right? They would think to themselves, oh, if they can arrest Paul, one of the leaders of the early church, then surely I'm next. But what Paul reports is that they were not filled with fear. Instead, they saw how Paul responded, and Paul responded with boldness, right? He did not live a timid faith. He said, it's okay that I'm in prison. God's still going to use this. And what happened is that inspired most of the believers in Rome, a massive city at that time, to say that's the kind of faith we want. That's how we want to live our lives as well. If God can do that in Paul, then God can do that in my life as well. And you know what? God can do that in your life too. When we say, God, here's my whole life, with all of the fractures, with all of the conflicts, with all the things that I wish no one else saw, God, I'm going to offer it all to you. And God, won't you use it? Use it to spread the gospel in this world, spread your good news of salvation. Let me and my circumstances be a tool, God, that only you can use. If we begin to see our life through that lens of faithfulness, then no matter what you go through, what you can find in that moment is joy. Is joy. Yes, remember, always be full of joy. Where? In the Lord. I say it again. Rejoice. Amen.
If you would like more information about Unity Presbyterian Church, please visit our website at www.unitypres.org or visit us on Facebook. This is the Unity Presbyterian Church podcast. Have a great week.